We've moved from 1 Kings to 2 Kings. I skipped some stories along the way of Elijah and Elisha, and we're making the transition now from Elijah's time as the major prophet of Israel to his disciple Elisha, picking up his mantle, literally passing of the mantle, passing of the baton, as Elisha becomes the prophet of God. So we're in 2 Kings, the second chapter. I'll read the first 18 verses. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "but do not speak of it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied, "but do not speak of it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men of the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise not." As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel!" And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them apart. He picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. "Look," they said, "we, your servants, have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on some mountain or in some valley." "No," Elisha replied, "do not send them." But they persisted until he was too ashamed to refuse. So he said, "Send them." And they sent 50 men, who searched for 3 days, but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, so I have a few goals. I want to make an exciting story not boring. I want not to tell you everything that I want to tell you about this passage. I had 3 goals. These are new. The first service had no goals. The first service I told almost everything I wanted to tell, and we got out of here about 9:40. That's not true, but it was late. It's an amazing story, and there are things that you'll understand better along the way, and so a couple of them I have to share with you so that we understand a little bit of what's going on. I don't have time to tell you all the things that the first people who heard this story were thinking of as the story progressed. I will tell you this. It starts out terribly. No able-bodied, able-minded, able-speaking storyteller would begin a good story this way. He tells you the end before he gets started. He gives away the punchline before he's even told you the story. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, oh, well then, I don't know why we'd read the rest of it. Now we know what's going to happen. I'm told that there are people out there, maybe some of you are like them, who when you get a new book, you flip to the end to see if you're going to like the way it ends before you read it. If you are one of those people, do not tell me. There are people who get to a scary part in the book. Some people near and dear to me then stop reading the book for a while until they can face it. Others skip ahead a few pages to see if it's going to be okay, and then they go back and pick it up. But no author would tell a really pretty powerful dramatic story by telling you at the beginning, oh, by the way, Elijah's going to go up in a whirlwind. Let me tell you how that happened. Here's the reason why it starts so awfully, terribly. Everybody knew. Everybody knew what happened. As soon as we get to this point in the story of Elijah and Elisha, the person writing this down knows everybody's already heard of this. Because as soon as it happened, the 50 prophets who were there, plus the others, the ones who went searching and didn't find Elijah, plus everybody else, start telling everybody they can find. Elijah was known throughout the land, not only in the northern kingdom, but in the southern. Now Elisha is going to be known everywhere. But everybody remembers what happened to Elijah. This has never happened before. Like I said, Enoch is the only guy we know about to this point who did not die, but suddenly was here and then was gone. He was no more because the Lord took him. He's the only guy in the history of the Bible who had this happen to him until Elijah. So everybody knew. By the time he got around to writing it down and putting it in this book, people knew the story. So he wasn't killing the punchline for any of them. You know, Elijah at the end, everyone, oh, right, the whirlwind, the chariots of fire. They all know. You know the story as well. So he doesn't start out so badly. He's just letting you know, now I'm going to tell you what happened at that point. Powerful, dramatic story. He actually does structure it pretty well once he starts telling it. There's all this repetition, right? The company of the prophets come. Do you know that Elijah's going away? Yes, I do. Don't talk about it. And Elijah says, stay here. I'm not going to stay here. He makes an oath every time. As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. Elisha seems to be a bit more loyal to Elijah than the other way around. And that's another thing I'd love to talk to you about, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to tell you everything I want to tell you. Oh, there's just so much. As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. This is the disciple who ran after Elijah when he was first called to serve him. He ran after him. And it wasn't just to say, hey, can I go back and tell my parents goodbye? It was because this was the joy of his life to follow Elijah. But Elijah knew all along he would be passing the baton. He would be passing on the mantle. That's where we get this phrase. The cloak of Elijah is then passed on to Elisha. Amazing things are going to happen, but the thing that hit me this week, which hadn't before, I knew that Elisha was upset when Elijah was taken from him, and I knew that the people went out looking for him, and they were upset because it's a major transition. This is a huge change. The word of the Lord came through Elijah, and now what's going to happen? He's gone, but Elisha is here. But there's really a cloud over the whole story. There are a lot of sad people in this story. I thought Elisha was just brokenhearted because this one he looked up to who did these amazing things was taken from him. But there is sort of the feel of death the whole way through. Elijah keeps trying to go himself, but Elisha won't let him. The company of the prophets, Elijah's wrong, by the way. They're killing all the prophets and I'm the only one left. Every town he gets to has a whole group of prophets, so he wasn't exactly right about that. But each one comes up to Elisha, pulls him aside. Now you know, today's the day. Everybody knew this would be the day. Elijah was going to be taken away. Nobody knew how, but Elijah knew it, didn't want to think about it much. Elisha knew it, didn't want to talk about it. And all of the prophets feel like it's their responsibility to say, you do know this is the day that you're going to lose him. We rarely know these things quite so obviously and explicitly. But as I asked the kids, did he die? Everyone's acting like he died, but we're not told that at all. It is a separation, and it's painful and it's difficult, but pretty clear that he does not die. He is taken to heaven. So over and over again, Elisha, stay here, not going to do it, makes an oath, I'm not going to do it. The prophets of the next place say, you know, he's going to be taken from you. And then remarkable things begin to take place. Not just that prophets know these things. Elijah, Elisha, and all the companies of prophets, they all know what God has in store here, even if nobody's exactly sure how it's going to play out. So they go to the banks of the Jordan River. Elijah cannot shake Elisha. He keeps coming along like the dog that follows him home. He insists on being with him. 50 men of the company of prophets are there, and they stand and watch. And Elijah walks up to the Jordan River, rolls up his cloak, so it's kind of like a staff, rolls up his cloak, hits the water with it, and the Jordan River stops flowing. It has done this once before. But you're not supposed to think of the Jordan here. This is the amazing thing. A dramatic, amazing story of God's miraculous power is being told, and at the whole time, what you're supposed to see in your mind's eye and hear in the background is the story of God delivering His people from slavery in Egypt through the Red Sea and eventually to the Promised Land. This is Exodus done over again. In short, in summary, Moses strikes the Red Sea with his staff, and the waters part, and the Israelites go through on dry ground. It's not all of Israel. It's the prophet of God, the prophet of the Lord, and his disciple. But when the waters part and they walk through, and they're going west to east at this point in the journey, you're supposed to think of Exodus, the Red Sea, God heard his people's cries, knew that they were in trouble, and delivered them through Moses, his prophet, and his friend. Moses was succeeded by another prophet. They walked through. Keep that in the back of your mind, because there are other times that people have gone through a sea on dry ground. So they go to the other side. Presumably then the waters come together again. The river starts flowing. They get across. And Elijah says to Elisha, what do you want me to do for you before I am taken from you? And that's the language all along. He's going to be taken from you. He's going to be taken from you. Amazing. Dramatic. And they know what's going to happen. Not how, but they know that it's going to happen, and Elisha will feel the loss here. Okay, here's the thing that I do have to tell you. Can't stand not to tell you. Because you might think that what Elisha asks for is a bit of a greedy thing to ask. And that's the reason that I did the counterpoint with James and John asking Jesus, can we sit at your right hand, at your left? Acting like that's no big deal when those are the two positions of prominence. And all the other 10 disciples were mad about it. Not just because James and John had the gall to ask Jesus, but because they didn't ask him. What if we don't get to sit there? What he asks means something entirely different, and it is very significant. What can I do for you before I'm taken from you? Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. For years and years and years and years, what I thought Elisha was asking was, I know I'm going to succeed. Give me twice the power that you have already shown to the people. The power of God working through you. The miracles that you did, let me be able to do them, but twice what you were able to do. And I thought, that's a weird thing. And then Elijah says, it's a difficult thing you've asked. And so I think, oh, he's not supposed to ask for that. That's too much. Couldn't have been more wrong. He is asking something that is difficult and is important, but he's not asking to be twice as big and twice as powerful as Elijah. What he's asking for, Elijah understands immediately, and most of the people hearing the story understood immediately because they spent so much time in the Bible, particularly Genesis through Deuteronomy, and they'd read God's instructions for his people, not just the history of creation and then the patriarchs and then the Exodus and all that. But in Deuteronomy, when God's telling people, this is how I want you to order yourselves as a society built in the sight of God and to show God's light and love to the world, here's what he said when it comes to inheritance. Inheritance. The eldest shall receive a double portion compared to everybody else. When Elisha says, give me a double portion of your spirit, he is asking for an inheritance. So death is still in the background. That's still the context in which they're speaking. What he's saying is, I want you to claim me as your son, and I want to claim you as my father, and I want to receive from you what you have to give. Elijah never owned land. Elijah didn't own a house, or Elijah didn't have any money to give him. He was a wandering prophet out in the middle of the world. But what he did have was what God had given him. The Spirit of the Lord, which came upon him in power and enabled him to do in the name of the Lord and according to God's plan, amazing miracles. So Elisha isn't saying, make me twice as good as you. Elisha's saying, grant to me an inheritance as father to son, so that I'm truly your successor and truly in your line, so that I can continue to be used by God in the way that you were. A double portion of your spirit just means the right of the eldest to receive the inheritance. You know the cloak's an inheritance sign, right? I've told you that enough times. Please tell me you remember that, right? That if somebody puts a cloak on somebody else, that's a sign of inheritance. So the whole problem with Joseph's coat of many colors was not that it was fancy and nobody else got one. It was because he was going to get the big chunk of the inheritance, the double portion. Oh, okay. I'm not allowed to tell you that today. Really important. It's an inheritance thing. It's a passing down. And what does Elijah have to give? The power and the Spirit of God so that he can do miracles, so that the people will continue to come back to God. They're walking and talking. Of course, the qualification. If you see me when I go, yes. If not, then I guess not. Elijah didn't have a lot of good things to say, but they're walking along, they're talking together, and then suddenly separated. And God shows up. A chariot of fire and horses of fire separate them, and then Elijah goes up in the whirlwind. Signs of God's presence. We've been over this a lot, not only with Elijah and Elisha, but in the prophets and an Old Testament survey for those of you who've been working with me from September through the summer last year. Signs of God's presence. Fire, wind, cloud. A whirlwind in the desert is going to cause a lot of dust to go up. So this is for sure and certain God showing up. but in ways that nobody had ever seen. A chariot of fire and horses of fire roll through, and what Elisha sees there is not just this frightening image of fiery horses and chariots. He sees the heavenly host, the army of God, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. These are the angels of God there to show His power and to do His purposes and to fight battles for God. That's what he sees. It's scary, but it's also thrilling. God is here in power, and nothing can stand against Him. The whirlwind, the cloud, and the wind of the Spirit, and it rushes Elijah straight up to heaven. My father, inheritance, right? Claimed each other, father and son. My father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them apart. That's a sign of mourning. That's a sign of grief. And you see that even today in the Middle East. If you're paying attention, when you see images of people who have been hit by terrorist attacks in the Middle East and other places as well, after violence, people who've lost loved ones, sometimes you'll see a picture of them going down the street and their clothes are torn. That is a more than 3,000-year-old signal of mourning and grief. Ripping of the clothes to say, I'm at the end of my rope. There's nothing else I can do. I'm utterly devastated. He takes his own clothes and rips them, but he finds that some of Elijah's clothes are still there. The mantle, the cloak is still there. And so he picks it up. Elisha is not ready for Elijah to go. Elijah does not seem quite ready to be out of the picture, by the way. The company of the prophets, all of them are not ready for Elijah to be taken up from him. So Elisha is feeling the pain, the separation, the breaking of his heart. He's a little angry too. When he comes up to the river, he is wondering what is going to happen to now. My master, my teacher is now gone. This powerful prophet, powerful in word and deed, has been taken up. What is going to happen to us? What's going to happen to me? He takes the cloak and he strikes the water with it. Not in the same way Elijah did. He's upset. Where now is the Lord, the God of Israel? If you ask questions of God, He often answers. And Elisha got a pretty quick answer. The water parts. Where now is He? He's right here. Right here in power, right here to save. Elisha's on the east bank of the Jordan River. The water parts. He walks through on dry ground. That's exactly what happened in the passage that Jay read. Exactly what happened instead in the Joshua story. The Ark of the Covenant comes into the middle of the river, and the river piles up at a heap, and the people go through on dry land. This is the atmosphere. This is the context. This is the background music for everyone hearing this story and learning about what happened here. God did it again. He did it again. Before, all of God's people were enslaved in Egypt, and God brought them out and through the Red Sea, and the waters covered all the enemies of God. Then, after a time of wandering in the wilderness, they make it all the way to the banks of the Jordan River, and on the east side of the Promised Land, Moses, who has led them all this way, all these decades, Moses dies, and his successor, his right-hand man, who has a name very similar to Elisha, by the way, Joshua, takes the people through to the Promised Land on dry ground through the Jordan River. Elisha's name means God saves. Joshua's name means the Lord Yahweh saves. Elisha was Elijah's right-hand man, just as Joshua, years and years before, was Moses' right-hand man and successor. So what's going on? You remember Exodus, the Red Sea, because that is the primary defining of the people of God up until the time of Jesus. The major story was once we were enslaved in Egypt and God set us free. Every single Passover they remembered that story. That's their story, that's their history. More than that, now they see that they walked through the Jordan River on dry land and entered into the Promised Land. Finally, Elijah comes along to a people who are not in bondage to a foreign country, but they are in bondage to false gods. And they're worshiping all these gods, but particularly the Baals and the Asherahs. And Elijah comes to lead them back to the one true God, back to right worship, back to right living, back to a right relationship with the one true God. And Elisha is going to continue the story. And just as Joshua brought the people in through the Jordan River on dry ground, so Elisha walks back over on dry ground to say, the people are coming back Two major stories, both very dramatic. The Exodus story, the people were enslaved and now they are free and God provided for them and brought them into the promised land. Elijah and Elisha, the people were in bondage to false gods, living ways that would only lead to death instead of life. And God says, I'm going to bring you back because wherever you have wandered, I can find you. Wherever you go, I can bring you back. And through Elijah and Elisha, He's going to do that. There is another Exodus, by the way. The other Exodus is the coming of Jesus to come and bring us not out of bondage to Egypt and not wandering after false gods so much as in bondage to sin and death. We were surely dead and God made us alive in Christ. We were surely lost and God found us in Jesus Christ and He leads us back to Himself. These are the three great stories. The people hearing this only knew this is really exciting. Chariots of fire and oh right, it's like Exodus and it's like coming into the promised land. But we, 2,800 or so years later, also know that God never forsakes His people. Wherever we wander, He can bring us back. Wherever we are lost, He can find us. When we were dead, He can make us alive again. The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha. God does save. And 800 years or so later, Jesus comes to lead His people once again out of the wilderness into the promised land of the presence of God. We have been found by this same powerful, saving, remembering, dramatic God. Will you pray with me? Lord God, it is easy for us to find ourselves yelling, where are you? Where now is the Lord, the God of Israel, the God of Elijah? Help us to see that you do show up, sometimes in might and power, and sometimes in ways that we do not see. But you have the same power available to you, driven by the same love of your people, so that you can make the dead live, and you can make the lost found, and you can make us who were strangers your own children, daughters and sons of the Most High God. We are humbly thankful as we come to the table where we see exactly how you made it possible for us to come into your family, how you made it possible for us to live together